Hey y'all, it's entry number 62 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Joe Burrow, quarterback, Cincinnati Bengals. The positives with Joe Burrow's fantasy profile. Great weapons. Joe Burrow gets to throw the ball to two of the best wide receivers in the league, in Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Both Higgins and Chase had over 70 receptions, over 1,090 receiving yards, and 6 or more receiving touchdowns in 2021. In addition, Burrow also has an above-average running back who is a capable pass catcher in Joe Mixon. Having great weapons around him makes it easier for Burrow to be more successful. Next up on the positives for Joe Burrow's fantasy profile is the improved offensive line. The big thing that the Cincinnati Bengals did this offseason was improve the offensive line. At the end of the 2021 season, the Bengals' offensive line ranked 20th in the league according to Pro Football Focus, but they decided to completely shake it up this offseason with the line, with the only projected returning starter being left tackle Jonah Williams. Otherwise, they will make changes at left guard, center, right guard, and right tackle. After all of these moves, going into the 2022 season, they are projected to have the 8th best offensive line in the league according to Pro Football Focus. This should help Burrow not be the most sacked quarterback in the league again in 2022. The last thing I really like about Joe Burrow's fantasy profile is his raw passing talent. In 2021, Joe Burrow completed 366 passes on 520 passing attempts for 4,611 passing yards and 34 passing touchdowns, which is obviously very good. But perhaps more impressive are some of his advanced stats. Joe Burrow finished first in passing yards per an attempt with 8.9. Second in true completion percentage with 74.8%, 8th in deep ball completion percentage with 43.1%, third in red zone completion percentage with 63.3%, and first in clean pocket completion percentage with 76.2% according to Player Profiler. Moving on to some of the concerns with Joe Burrow's fantasy profile. We'll start with the fact that there's not a lot of rushing upside in his profile relative to other top quarterbacks. During the 2022 season, Joe Burrow carried the ball 40 times for 118 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. His rushing upside isn't nearly as high as many of the quarterbacks going around his draft range, and as we know, rushing upside makes it significantly easier for a quarterback to be a top-tier fantasy finisher. See guys like Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson in recent years. The next concern I have with Joe Burrow's fantasy profile is his injury risk. Joe Burrow has taken a beating in his first 2 years at the NFL level and has quite the injury history since joining the league. In November of 2020, he destroyed his knee with an ACL, MCL, PCL, and meniscus tear, which caused him to miss the last 6 games of the 2020 season. And while he played in all but 1 game in the 2021 season, he took a beating with a finger dislocation in December of 2021, a knee strain in January of 2022, and a grade 2 MCL sprain in the Super Bowl. While the offensive line should protect him a little better this year, he is still listed as a very high risk for injury in 2022 on Draft Sharks. The last concern I have with Joe Burrow's fantasy profile is that he didn't have as many boom fantasy games in 2021 as other top fantasy quarterbacks. This one is pretty picky, but we'll mention it nonetheless. In 2021, Joe Burrow had 2 out of 16 games with 0 to 10 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 5 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 3 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. It's worth noting that 2 of these 25 plus fantasy point games were against the Baltimore Ravens, who had a ton of injuries to their secondary, which resulted in the Ravens having their worst passing defense season under John Harbaugh by far. And that's something that you can't necessarily count on happening again in 2022. Because he picked the best time to have his boom games, in the fantasy playoffs, it was less noticeable, but he hasn't quite shown the same level of fantasy gear of I'm going to win this guy his fantasy week myself as some of the other top fantasy QB options. Some additional thoughts on Joe Burrow's fantasy profile. In terms of total fantasy points, Joe Burrow finished as the QB8 in 2021 with 328.1 total fantasy points and 20.5 fantasy points per game. In terms of fantasy points per game, he finished as the QB10 according to Fantasy Pros. In 2020, Joe Burrow finished as the QB25 in terms of total fantasy points, with 178.6 total fantasy points and the QB17 in fantasy points per game among quarterbacks that played at least 8 games, with 17.9 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Cincinnati Bengals head coach Zach Taylor's teams have averaged 35.59 passing attempts over the course of his career as an offensive coordinator or head coach, which is around the league averages. Personal opinion: Joe Burrow is currently going off the board as QB9 about pick 79 overall on ESPN and QB5 about pick 51 overall on Yahoo. As great of a real-life player Joe Burrow is, his Yahoo ADP seems pretty high right now. He hasn't shown much rushing upside yet, and I think he may be getting a little bit of the Super Bowl name brand tax on Yahoo. On ESPN, he seems to be going at a reasonable price, and I could maybe see myself getting some shares there. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Joe Burrow's My Cause My Cleats in 2021 was for the Joe Burrow Hunger Relief Fund. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.